Good morning. So 2,500, that is a massive number. So I wonder if we can talk first about what it takes to become a B Corp. So if I, run a clothing company and I say, yeah, that B Corp thing, I like it. What would I need to do to be certified?
Sure. Has everybody heard of a B corporation?
See,
Great.
I
Just
told you.
always a good idea to poll the audience and make sure people know what that is. So companies that want to be recognized for their social and environmental impact can get certified as a B corporation. It's a little bit like fair trade for coffee or organic for milk, but it's about the whole company. And so when we certify companies as B corporations, we try to look at how they have an impact on all of their stakeholders, not just one. And so companies are assessed on how they impact the communities in which they do business, their workers, the environment, their consumers, and they have to meet a really high set of social and environmental performance standards. But the second thing companies have to do in order to get certified as a B corporation is to go a little bit further. It's to actually make themselves legally accountable to create value for their stakeholders, not just for their shareholders. And that involves actually taking a shareholder vote to change their legal accountability. And that's like a pretty significant shift and a pretty high bar for a lot of companies.
Yeah, what is the consequence if they then do not fulfill that legal mandate?
Well, then they can't get certified as a B Corp.
Yeah. Have you had to revoke certifications?
Yeah, there are I mean, we've been around for 11 years now, certifying companies. There are about 2,700 companies actually that have gotten certified in 70 countries around the world, and so it's become a global movement. Very low turnover, a little over 5% turnover or churn each year. Some companies go out of business, just like lots of companies in the economy. And a few companies each year fall below the bar, and so they leave the community.
Is it harder to become a B Corp or to stay one?
I think it's probably harder to become one.
Yeah.
One of the really cool things about joining a community or a movement is that once you're in it, everybody wants you to be there, and it becomes kind of a race to the top. And so one of the really cool things that we've seen over the years is companies starting to challenge each other once they're in the community to do even better, to improve. And so like last year, we launched something called the Inclusive Economy Challenge, which was really focused on getting companies not just to meet the bar of being certified, but to actually identify specific things that they could do to create a more inclusive economy. And whether that was trying to create living wages for all of their workers, or making sure that they were hiring people in marginalized communities or people coming out of prison. There were lots of things that companies can do to take action and try to improve the communities in which they do business. And that's been a really inspiring thing to watch.
Yeah. So you talked a lot about there are various things that being a B Corp kind of entails. I'm wondering if there's one broad, succinct idea that you want people to think of when they hear B Corp or when they hear that a company is a B Corp.
It's a good company.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I'm wondering, do you think it's difficult for larger companies versus kind of smaller, mom and pop owned to become B Corps or to kind of really integrate this type of kind of doing good into the very fabric of their company? Do you think there's a differentiation between kind of smaller and larger companies?
Yeah, when we started, the B Corp movement when we started was made up entirely of private companies, mostly family-owned businesses, who could sort of make a decision to do something like change their legal accountability, at the dinner table. Over time, that idea got more and more popular with larger companies, with companies that were subsidiaries of big public companies, of companies that were raising venture and private equity capital. And so as that transition has happened, we've had to think about things like the standards need to look a little bit different for a company with 10,000 or 100,000 or 1 million employees than it does for a 5 or a 10-person company. But increasingly, really large companies want to be part of that community, and it's really driven by this idea of purpose, I think, that their employees are the ones who are really driving it. So it's often not like the CEO of a big public company says, hey, we should be a B Corp, but the CEO is hearing it from people who work there, particularly millennials, but lots of others who want a sense of purpose at work, and they want a way to be able to communicate that the company that they work for is a good company. And so that idea of being able to attract and retain talent is often what's driving a lot of the larger companies to become B Corps. Although I think also the brand, as it's become known over 10 or 11 years, has also started to make people see that there's an opportunity, particularly for like consumer products or consumer-facing businesses, whether it's a company like Patagonia or a bank like Beneficial State Bank.
Yeah. How are you thinking about scaling that? We talked a little bit backstage about the idea of kind of scaling to all of these very large public corporations that have shareholders to answer to.
Right.
And the idea of answering to shareholders has become kind of a preeminent question, a preeminent issue that large public companies are dealing with. So I'm wondering how you guys are thinking about refining the model to allow companies like that to take seriously the idea of becoming B Corps.
So it's the same model, and it's slow in the public markets. This idea of shareholder primacy, Milton Friedman and then Michael Jensen generating this idea that the only purpose, the only duty of the directors of a corporation is to enhance shareholder value to the exclusion of everybody else, is a pretty powerful idea. And whether people think about it as a legal idea or like a cultural norm, it's become the way people think about the purpose of business. And so that's a huge challenge to overcome. That's why we're here.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons for having that legal component to the certification is to make it real, because as that idea of purpose in companies has become more powerful, every company knows it. And so if you open up a magazine, just about every ad has got windmills and solar panels and African farmers holding fertile earth, and it doesn't really matter what the ad is for, what the company does. That's what the ad says. And that tells you a lot about how companies want to market themselves. And so like the whole point of having a certification with a high bar is to make sure that people can know that it's authentic and that it actually really means something. And in the public markets, that's a challenge, often not because companies often want to do it. Shareholders, and in particular big institutions in the public markets, are often a huge impediment. And so one of the biggest jobs we have is to upend this idea of shareholder primacy, to help people see that there's value in purpose, and that particularly if they can think a little bit more long-term than short-term, that there's real value for these companies in becoming B Corps.
What do you think was kind of the moment of change or the thing that triggered this idea that purpose should become a part of business?
I think it's like a lot of things, people like to look for like a moment.
Yeah.
And I actually don't think there's really been one. I think it's been like we're standing on the shoulders of a lot of people who did this in the wilderness for a long time. And so in the capital markets, you could look to divestment in South Africa as like an early version of this, or corporate social responsibility, or the things that like Newman's Own or Ben and Jerry's did a long, long time ago, or the Body Shop. And I think that idea has steadily built. I think the millennial generation has been really powerful both as a consumer and as a worker voice. And about 10 years ago, this idea of impact investing started, where more and more people realized that they wanted to be able to actually have their investments have some meaning and some impact as well. And so I think it's more like a building wave,
Yeah.
Than a single moment.
Yeah. I think when we think back before, maybe the past 10 or 15 years, a lot of companies would say, I have a philanthropy department, we give, we do charity, perhaps we're starting up CSR. Why isn't that enough?
Because that doesn't really solve the big problems that society faces. Like this idea that, particularly in the absence of government being able to take action, that there's a role for business as a steward in society, won't happen from businesses choosing to do a little bit of charity in the communities where they do business. And I think this has been written about a lot recently in an environment with incredible level of inequality. If businesses are paying workers less and less, or creating fewer and fewer benefits, or offshoring more and more jobs, and then the company or one CEO is giving a little bit of money away on the side, they're mostly putting Band-Aids on bigger problems that they're actually creating through the business itself. And so the idea of B Corp certification is not to try to solve one small problem, but to try to fix the whole system. Like I've heard people talk about it this way. It's not that helpful to have to sell organic lettuce that's a little bit better for the environment if you are treating all of the workers who are picking the lettuce in the same lousy way that that the agricultural industry often does. And so we really need to look to the whole of the business and the whole of the business system in which those businesses operate.
Yeah. I want to take a break for a second to let the audience know that we will be coming to you for questions. I have another question or two for Andrew, but if you could start thinking now, making sure that it's a question, condensing that question all the way down, and then you can get your hands up when I call for you. There are mic runners on the sides. So I want to talk a little bit about the companies that have chosen to kind of go through this path. I think there are a lot of ones that are really well known. Patagonia was mentioned earlier. We talked about King Arthur Flour as a baker. I super love them. Yeah. But what are some of the perhaps lesser known companies, but who are B Corps, who you think are doing really outstanding work to kind of fulfill the mission that you guys thought of when you thought of B Corp?
Yeah, so there's an incredible range of businesses. I'll give you one example. Lots of people have probably heard of Allbirds. They make the really cool shoes that a lot of people wear. A business that's got a lot of environmental and social responsibility built into their business, and they just raised $150 million of capital from big venture and private equity firms. And so it's a business that's scaling really rapidly into the capital markets. At the other end of the spectrum, there's an incredible company that I really love just up in Yonkers, New York, called Greyston Bakery. If you like Ben & Jerry's chocolate fudge brownie ice cream, they make the brownies that go into the ice cream. And their whole business model is built on the idea that their motto is, we don't hire people to bake brownies, we bake brownies to hire people. And they create pathways for people coming out of prison, returning citizens, to start to put their lives back together, create jobs and financial wellness, and then move on into the mainstream economy. Yeah. And so, there's a huge range of businesses, but there are also lots of businesses that are not in consumer products that you will have never heard of. There's a company called Cascade Engineering that's a $500 million family business in Michigan that makes a range of industrial products. But they've created really high quality jobs for marginalized people in communities that have been affected by everything from the opioid crisis to the hollowing out of industry in the Midwest.
So B Corps really kind of cover the waterfront when it comes to industry.
Yeah, I think at last count about 135 different industries in those 70 countries. So just about every industry, and people do it for lots of different reasons. But there's a reason to be a good company in every industry.
Yeah. Earlier, you said that the idea of doing good, just being a good company, is not new. That companies were doing it kind of siloed and individually for a really long time, and now there's been some momentum behind it. I wonder if you worry at all that that's a trend, or that eventually kind of the will to do that will go away, particularly when we think about the economic cycle and what companies are worried about, how much money they have to put towards various things.
Yeah, I think it's the opposite of a fad.
Yeah.
It's been a long building correction, maybe you could say, and in some ways a return to an old conservative with a small c idea of the role of business in society, the proper role of business in society and the responsibility of business as a steward in society. And I think whether that's about workers increasingly saying that they want to work for companies that reflect their values, or consumers who want to buy from them. Actually, one cool thing, we launched yesterday, the day after the election, a campaign called Vote Every Day. And the idea was people can vote we play a lot of different roles in our lives in society today, as worker, as investor, as member of a community, as consumer. And in each of those ways, we can have purpose through all of those different decisions. We can vote every day.
Yeah. All right, let's go to the audience for some questions if we have any. I cannot see. There's one back there, and there's one up front, whichever you're closer to.
I'm David Hessekiel. I'm the founder of Engage for Good. And I heard 2 weeks ago the CEO of Danone in North America talk about how they are now the largest B Corp.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, two questions. One, what was the hardest thing of scaling up for your organization in terms of dealing with a company of that size? And do you think that they are an outlier, or do you think that there will be other very large companies that will make this jump?
Great question. So the big challenge when you're trying to assess a really big company with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of employees is having a set of standards that can address the incredible breadth of what a big multinational does. And so that's been for what was a small nonprofit, like a huge scaling challenge. But the second part of your question, no, I think that is the trend. Like Danone has been one of the first really large companies to decide that they were committed to this. The CEO of Danone, which is a big public company based in France, but I think about 35 or 40% of its revenues are here in the U.S. Stood up not in front of consumers or not in front of workers, but they chose at his shareholder meeting to tell his shareholders that this is the future of capitalism, and that Danone was on a journey. It wasn't going to happen overnight for a really big multinational, but that they were on a journey to be a B Corp. That's how they were going to express this change in the purpose of capitalism. And they have done it very methodically by certifying subsidiaries. Danone North America, which is a merger between their yogurt business and White Wave, which was a public company, was like their first really big effort to do that, and it took a couple of years for them to get through that process. And now they're trying to work on doing that for the whole company. But there's lots of big multinationals that are on that journey. Paul Pullman at Unilever has talked about this, and I think in the last 18 months they've bought 5 or 6 B Corps to become subsidiaries. Companies like Sundial Brands, which is an African American owned business on Long Island. And they've been marching through that process in a different way by being a buyer of B Corps. And there's lots of other examples, but I think multinationals are doing it because they're hearing from their workers, they're hearing from their consumers. Like the example of Colin Kaepernick and Nike was brought up earlier. I think that's a really powerful example from a consumer perspective, and they're hearing it from their investors. Like investors increasingly see this issue, whether they see it as a set of ESG risks or ESG opportunities, ESG, environmental, social, and governance. They're increasingly hearing, companies are increasingly hearing that from their investors. Everyone from like high net worth individuals who want their money to have more purpose to Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, the largest institutional investor on the planet. And that's helping to drive multinationals.
Question right over here.
Oh, good morning. Thank you very much for bringing B Corp to us. I was wondering if you could share how B Corp is funded.
How we're funded?
Yes.
Yeah, so the organization that I helped to start is called B Lab. We're a nonprofit, and the sort of the business model is a nonprofit. It's not a great business model, but the business model is and that's why we're a nonprofit, is that companies pay a license fee to be certified, an annual license fee. And so like this year, we're about a $12 million, we have a $12 million operating budget. About $7.5 million of that comes from earned revenue from those license fees, and the rest is covered by philanthropy. And the reason for that is, like the way we see our role is we're a systems change organization, and we're trying to build market infrastructure for a different kind of capitalism. And we're trying to do that ahead of the market. And so we need to be a nonprofit, both for the integrity of the standards, but also to have a model that allows us to raise some philanthropy to be ahead of the market in building things like the standards and the legal structures for large multinationals to be able to go through the certification process.
All right, and I think we have one more right there.
Hi, my name is Madeline Evans. I work at the International Well Building Institute. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the differences between a legally recognized public benefit corporation and one that actually chooses to pursue the B Corp designation, and whether those two things are complementary to one another or, in fact, more of an alternative to one another.
Sure. Thanks for raising that distinction, because it's a complicated one. So one of the things we realized early on when we were trying to address the legal component of the certification, like changing a company's legal accountability to consider the interest of stakeholders, was that actually corporate law in many places, and in particular in Delaware, doesn't actually allow for it. And so if a company 5 or 6 years ago, if a company had taken a shareholder vote to add some language to their corporate articles that said, we'll consider the interests of our stakeholders, not just our shareholders, when we make decisions, and they had sent it to the Delaware Secretary of State, the Secretary of State would have sent it back to them with a rejected stamp on it. Because their view, based in legal precedent in the courts, was that the legal duty of the directors was to maximize value for shareholders, and therefore that amendment to the articles would actually be like a violation of court precedent under Delaware law. And so one of the things we had to do was start to ask states to actually amend their corporate statutes. And so there are now 35 states in the US and a couple countries, I think Italy and Colombia and a bunch of others, that have actually created what are called benefit corporation statutes, that a company can actually take a shareholder vote and opt into that. And so companies that get certified as B Corps, one way that they can meet the legal requirement for certification is by adopting that new legal form in Delaware.
All right. Everyone, please join me in thanking Andrew.
Thanks.